Welcome to Wines of the South, a podcast dedicated to the exceptional wines and their makers of the Southern Hemisphere. Join me on the journey as I trawl through the vineyards, leaving no stone unturned as we dig up the untold stories and the hidden gems that make up the very best of what the South has to offer. The first season and the start of this magical journey begins at the tip of the African continent, in the winelands of the Cape of South Africa. It's a cool and overcast autumn day in Cape Town as I get into the car and prepare for the 2-hour journey into the Hemel and Aarde Valley, just outside the seaside town of Hermanus in the Western Cape of South Africa. It's a gorgeous part of the world and aptly named. Hemel and Aarde translated means heaven and earth, and it certainly feels that way. I'm on my way to see Chris Alheit of Alheit Vineyards. His philosophy: the true wonder of wine is revealed when all the nonsense and lies are stripped away. In other words, no yeasts, no enzymes, no acidification, no wood, no manipulation. Just the voice of the land. As I turn away from the coast and enter the valley, the temperature drops further and rain begins to fall. As I navigate the twists and turns of the road further and deeper into this stunning valley, my mind wanders to a time I was last taking these same turns to meet Chris for the first time, more than 10 years ago. A time when Chris's very first vintage was still lying in barrel, without a name, without a claim. At the time, I was importing South African wine into Taiwan, and on one of my trips home to South Africa, I went to stay with Chris and see what he was up to. A decade later, and a lot has changed, both for Chris and I. We're both a little bit older, and hopefully a little wiser. Both have kids running around, and the first signs of grey hair. The sprouting grey is probably nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the kids. And his wine now has a name. And boy, oh boy, does it have a claim. Unbeknownst to either of us at the time, that very first vintage would bust out of the barrel and take the world by storm, and Chris will go down in history as one of South Africa's great winemakers. But life as a winemaker wasn't always a given, and fate, the universe, or divine providence as Chris would call it, would conspire in unsuspecting ways, nudging him towards his destiny.
But I mean, depending on your worldview, you either think it's interesting coincidence or divine providence, one of the two. But I lean towards the latter, of course. My parents were both medical doctors, and I suppose that's, as a kid of 16, 17, 18, I didn't really know what was out there in the world. I obviously wanted to get into medicine, but I didn't have the marks at the end of my matric year at school. I figured if I did a Bachelor of Science degree, then maybe I could, through the back door, if I did well enough in my first year, get into medicine, because a few kids tried that and some of them succeeded. But I don't know, man, I was just kind of lost, after my gap year and working at a school and working at a pub and playing rugby at a club. I had quite an interesting gap year with a lot of travel in Europe and that kind of thing. I was quite demotivated. I felt a bit directionless doing science, and I suppose I was quite immature. I was a very poor student. I didn't really focus on my studies very much. For those listeners who've studied at Stellenbosch, you understand that campus life there is spectacular. And, I suppose one way of characterizing what happened to me in the first year was that, my immature self and campus life just collided with a lot of fanfare and celebration, and not a lot of focus. So, halfway through my first year, it became really apparent that I wasn't going anywhere near medicine, that was for sure, because, the marks were just not there and the effort levels, and I'd kind of, as I said, lost focus and lost my way a bit. I didn't have a direction, and that's not a good feeling. And then I started digging around a little bit to find out, what my options were if medicine was not an option. You have to forgive the background winery noises. That's where we are. And I had a few friends in Res with me that were doing winemaking, and one of them was a really, really good friend. And it sounded like such an interesting path to follow. I knew nothing about it. And yeah, so I figured out that I could change a few subjects and jump over to winemaking. So I had to work very hard for the first time in a while, for about 6 months, to get over into the winemaking course. And that was it. So I did viticulture and enology. And then I made a very, very interesting discovery in that class. It was that there was a young woman sitting there.
Ah, sweet amore. No story of wine would be complete without it. And the amazing Suzanne plays the part for us here, and indeed is an integral part to the story of the wine itself. She and Chris would finish their studies, fall in love and travel the world together, working vintages from Australia to California, Germany to Bordeaux. Working in such diverse environments would hone their craft, making them both seriously proficient winemakers. But if you ask me, far more valuable was the people they met and the philosophies that they were introduced to over the course of their travels. And it was some of these principles that would eventually lead to the creation of their first vintage. Their world, as well as ours, would never be the same again. But even the best winemakers need to pay their dues.
So the two of us finished at the same time. And then I need to try to work out what happened. She wanted to go to Australia to pay off a student loan. So she went to work at a place called Tintara, a big winery in McLaren Vale. And at that same time, I'd done, you have to do a few harvests before you qualify. So I had done one vintage at Fairview, which was awesome. The winemaking team there, Anthony Diago and those guys, it's an awesome team. And learned a great deal there. Mostly learned how to squeegee floors really well. I'm very good at that still.
I was going to ask, what does that involve?
It involves you just doing whatever you're told,
Yeah.
and trying to keep your attitude straight, because the hours are long, and it's at that stage you just know absolutely nothing. You know what it says in the textbooks, but you've never messed around with pumps and pipes
But you're learning. You're learning.
Yeah, you're learning. But the trouble with university educated folks, in a practical work environment, is that they know a lot about something that they know nothing about, basically. Which is kind of what it was like for me at Fairview. I tried my best, but there was just so much learning to do. And same at Flagstone. I worked at Flagstone in 2005 the next season, just to finish off my studies, basically. And great experience. I still think Bruce is one of the kind of rare minds of the wine industry. He's got these crazy ideas, and a very smart guy. And it was awesome to work for him. Learned a lot again. And Suzanne at that time was trying to work off her student loan, working in Australia. So where we finally sort of met each other again, we went off to California together, and that was the first vintage that we worked together. But all the cellar skills that I thought I'd learned at Fairview and Flagstone were no good in the States. Those guys that I was working with in the winery operating on a whole different level, just really fast, really accurate cellar work. And so just scrambling, trying to keep up with him. I think I almost got fired twice just from not being able to keep up. So from Napa, we went to Western Australia, and we worked at a massive winery outside of Perth called Horton. It's the biggest winery in Western Australia. And it was such a valuable experience. So we were, all, again, part of like a team of 40 kind of cellar interns, managing a massive harvest. I can't remember how many tons we did that year. It was big. I'll have to go and double check. But Suzanne had never actually been to Europe at all, and I'd been there a few times, but I'd never worked there. So off we went. We quit our jobs after the 2009 harvest in South Africa, and then worked in Saint-Emilion with a really great family. The winery's called Chateau Angelus. They're quite well known. Just the quality control there was insane. The level of effort they went to in the winery. was very impressive, and it was just cool. I mean, it was our first time like immersed in the French wine culture, and obviously at that stage we'd already figured out that Bordeaux and South Africa have very, very little in common in terms of climate, and it's not really a good model for us to look at. I know that's probably a slightly controversial statement, but it isn't. Climatologically speaking, it's not great for us to look at Bordeaux.
If not Bordeaux, what then? What style of wine is worth emulating on South African soil, or should local winemakers be trying to copy anything at all? Perhaps it's not the style of the wine in itself that is of interest, but rather the winemaking philosophy behind the wine. Chris and Suzanne weren't looking to bring European-style wine to South Africa, but it was in Europe that the penny dropped, and our young winemaking couple saw with crystal clarity their path laid out in front of them.
We went over to the south of France, close to a town called Perpignan. There's a winery there called Domaine Matassa, and he's that guy Tom Libber is a South African, and he's married into the Gorby family, and they've got Domaine Gorby. So we just spent a day with them, talking about what they were doing and tasting the wines they were making. It was really eye-opening, especially the way they looked at the viticulture and the totally non-interventionist winemaking. And Tom opened a 2003 Matassa Blanc for us out of Magnum at dinner, and it blew my mind, that wine. To see what they're doing with their old vine native whites. They've got Makebo and a few other Grenache Gris and a few other odds and ends over there that are really unique to the place. And then from there, we worked our way up to Germany, basically, and we worked the harvest there in Traub in the Middle Mosel, working with Riesling, some unbelievable old Riesling vineyards at Feingut Vollenweide. Very tough vintage, but learned a great deal from Daniel. A lot of those ideas are still applied today in the winemaking. So, we'd heard a lot about minimalist winemaking, but never actually done it. So with Daniel, it was the first time that we were seeing that, like, no sulfur at the press at all, nothing, just grape juice, no gas cover, just nothing, just pure grape juice going into a fermenter of some kind and being left alone until it starts fermenting. So yeah, Daniel was doing this minimalist winemaking, and his wines were just sublime. And his farming was also, he was farming organically. His vineyards looked completely different to the neighbors' vineyards, where it was just like black slate. And his vineyards, there were wild strawberries and butterflies, and it was incredible. And the wines tasted different. We tasted loads of wines in the Middle Mosel, and Daniel's wines tasted different. So we'd had this timer, okay, in 2010. So it really gets you thinking. If you have a glass of old Vino Certico from Santorini next to a glass of Grenache Gris or Makebo from Kals, next to a glass of Mosel Riesling, they're three completely different wines in the glass. There's nothing really in common there. Except for this really, really crucial common thread, which is the fact that they're all completely authentic wines, and that's an abused word these days, unfortunately, but they are completely authentic wines. They cannot come from anywhere else. And, that really rung true with myself and Suzanne. We thought about that a bit, and we decided that when we start our venture in the Cape, we want to make Cape wine, that can only come from the Cape. And that really leads you into a small clutch of grapes that we think we know, because the literature is a bit obscure. We think we know have been here for a very long time, since the 1650s, which is certainly long enough for us to think of them as items of heritage. And the awesome thing was that because Suzanne and I were traveling together, we were exposed to the same things. And so when we started our business together, it was very cool for us to have that shared core philosophy around what makes wine great, and what the potential mistakes are with winemaking. Yeah, it made life a lot easier, because we both listened to Sadi, we both listened to Libber, we both worked for Vollenweide. We had these shared sort of mentors, I suppose you could say, and we'd been to a tasting that Eben Sadi gave at Wine Cellar on his wines from Priorat. He was involved in that project at the time, which he's now he's quit that project since. But at the time, he was still very much involved. And we drove through from Stellenbosch. I remember it was Dani Karinas and Suzanne and myself in the car. And on the way through, we were very chatty and joking, and it was cool, nice to see Dani. And then we had this tasting with Eben. There were probably 45, 50 people in the room. Eben pouring those wines from those various vineyards in Priorat. And none of the wines are perfect, but every single one of them was brilliant, if you know what I mean. They had, these little idiosyncrasies and a lot of personality and charm, and very, very good wines. And just like wines that really spoke about a place, and that's a very attractive idea. And I remember on the way home, the car was dead quiet. After a few minutes, or I don't know how long, Dani just piped up from the backseat. He said, "Yes, julle, wat gaan ons nou doen?" Which basically means like, what the hell are we going to do now? Like you can't carry on your normal path with wine after that experience.
So do you think Sadi was someone who at that time you would have been looking up to? Or?
Yeah, definitely. I think Eben was and still is an exceptionally influential character in the Cape. Yeah, I think he had a very positive influence on the young winemakers of South Africa that saw that it's actually possible to start something and succeed, given that you are working with the correct philosophy, and also very positive for the Swartland. I think him and Charles Back was a big part of that story too. But with the confidence that they proceeded, to really put the Swartland on the map and not be shy to charge solid prices, and make a huge effort to really make quality wine from a very underrated area. And today, the Swartland is still probably the most exciting part of the Cape. That whole era is and was super influential on many young winemakers. And we're not young anymore, but we were younger then. That was 10 plus years ago. And it definitely are. Eben had a big influence, as did Adi, and the Molyneux were really up and coming at that point. The whole Swartland Revolution gang, and Mark Kent's project, they're just, it's all about perspective, and allowing young folks to think outside the box a little bit, by resetting the boundaries of what's possible in the Cape. And we've also, seeing that done, tried to follow suit by resetting boundaries of what we think were boundaries that, for Old Vine Shannon, and for what we consider basically a national treasure.
And so it was, with a philosophy inspired by their travels and a few local legends, as well as a few pockets of long since forgotten old Shannon vines, that Alheit Vineyards was born.
We wanted to make something like absolutely South African in its identity, and unquestionably high quality. So I made a great effort to find very, very special old vineyards. And I was helped in that regard by Rosa. She helped us with a couple. We'd found a few. I was on Google Earth and I was in the car, and lots of phone calls. And at that time, there were plenty of old vineyards around, mostly not very well farmed and mostly undervalued. And they're there, they're still there, but back then, there was like a treasure hunt. If you went looking for them, you could find them. You just had to be dedicated. And we found lots of old vineyards and lots of not so old vineyards in their 30s. So that's how you do it. You just drive around, you talk to people, and hope that they'll part with their grapes. And all of this was predicated upon the fact that the resource was undervalued and that the grape price in South Africa at the time, and still is, very, very low, too low to be sustainable. So when a youngster comes along with no track record and probably no prospects, and offers you double or triple what you are getting for a couple of tons, you might as well just take a risk and go for it. And most of them do and did. So that's how we ended up accruing, the parcels that we did over time. And most of those places where we got a foothold early on, we still have, and we now have like really big blocks big blocks, but like for a company our size, we have proper like a whole block that we can manage, or a whole section that comes just to us that we can, chat to the farmer about what he's doing, and the growers we're working with. So that whole process, Neil, happened, over the period of the first 2 or 3 years, and then even more, 4 years, we were always looking for new stuff and finding things sometimes, and then we went through a process of whittling down again, of sort of throwing away things that weren't actually as good as they looked initially, and building and breaking down and building and breaking down, until we now, 10 years later, are at a place where I can confidently say that all of the growers that we're working with are good growers, and all the vineyards we're working with are what I would call best of breed, within, the soil type that they're on, or the variety that they are hard to beat. And that's so because of the winemaking philosophy that underpins the business, we're absolutely dependent on the quality of the vineyard. I mean, we don't acidify, we don't use any selected yeasts, we don't use any new oak, we don't do anything to the wine. It's just grape juice, and so we really need that to be very good grape juice.
I want to read you something that I think you've said. The true wonder of wine is revealed when all the nonsense and lies are stripped away.
Amen. Sounds like a good quote. Is that me?
I think it's you.
Great. Yeah, I think that it depends on how you look at wine, and I'm not, it's very easy to get preachy and sound a bit ridiculous, assuming that everybody needs to hold up wine as some kind of idol in their lives and worship it and think that it must be a specific way, and that's not right either. It's perfectly acceptable for a company to make wine in whatever way they see fit and sell it as a product. That's totally fine. But in the space that we occupy, wine is a different thing. It is a very artisanal product, and it rubs shoulders very closely with art forms, even though I don't think it's strictly speaking art. It does move in the same areas. I don't think it's art simply because it's not the person that's expressing themselves. It's the person doing their best to allow the land to express itself. So the land is the star, not the person. And that's the subtle difference there. So I think that at the pointy end of the industry where we are with the higher prices and everything like that, I think that I don't think it's acceptable to manipulate the wine, and especially if you're trying to sell it honestly as a rare type of agricultural product from a very specific piece of land or specific types of vineyards, and this is how they taste, to then manipulate. It's fine to do it, as long as you're clear about it, as long as you are open about it, but if you are maintaining that you are adhering to a certain philosophy of purity, then you should do that. So I think a pure, clean philosophy is very, very important to the types of wines we're making, and to have the trust of the people that are buying the wine, to know that they know that this is grape juice from a good vineyard, spontaneously fermented with the yeast that come from that vineyard, with no external nonsense, and certainly not flavored with any trees or anything like that. It just is what it is, So that's what we're aiming for and hoping for.
So the last time I was here, you hadn't released your first vintage yet.
Sure, it's a long time ago.
We were barrel tasting what would be your first vintage. I don't even think you had a name for the wine yet. Can you remember what that felt like to put, because I imagine it's quite an expression of you coming through in that wine. What did it feel like to put that out into the world?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the emotions. We both had a very sort of childlike faith. We believed that God had opened all these doors for us to make this wine, and not that it had anything to do with His kingdom or anything like that, but just what we were going to do for a living. And we felt like that He would make a way. So it might sound strange to your listeners, but so I had a lot of faith that the thing would succeed. But I still, shat my pants every time I had to present the wine to somebody. Because I thought it was quite good, but I wasn't sure, because I was so biased towards the wine and towards the vineyards that I didn't really trust my judgment. And I remember taking the wine out of, taking a little barrel sample or a sample out of tank way too early, and stuffing it in front of Jamie Good at some Swartland event, and he tasted it and said, "Oh, that's pretty good," and I was devastated. I thought, "Oh, Jamie, it's not pretty good. It's really good. Come on." And but in my naivety and overzealous state. I should have just waited and let the wine be. Eventually, we released it in May, and by the time we did, the wine was closer to ready. And we had Richard Kelly has been with us since the very beginning, and it was really instrumental in helping to get us out there. But like all these crazy things happened. I mean, like Richard, on his way back from South Africa on that first visit, he'd come and sat with us here where you stayed with us in the cottage. He sat across the table and I opened the wine for him and sort of watched him nervously taste the wine. And this guy is a big deal. I mean, he knows Shannon backwards and knows the law very well and has lived in South Africa for 7 years and is a, MW and all that, very, very well respected guy. And there's a bit of a poker face when he tastes. He doesn't really show you anything when he's tasting. And then I just sort of saw the edge of his mouth turn up a little bit, and he started smiling, and he said, "Okay, so what's the plan?" I didn't know what he meant, And I said very naively and very honestly that I wanted to make the best white wine in South Africa. That was my ambition. And I don't know if we've ever achieved that since, but I have tried. But that was my honest ambition, really. And I wasn't trying to sound overconfident or anything. That's really what I wanted to do. I didn't expect that we were anywhere near doing it. But that's what I told him. And he said, no, that's not what he meant. He doesn't mean, what's my plan? I mean, what's the business plan? How are you going to do this? And I didn't have an answer. I didn't know. I'd made the wine and I was sitting looking at about 5,200 bottles or something like that, and I didn't know how I was going to sell it. I was just waiting for, as I said to you before, I was just waiting for the doors to open and something to happen. We'd already, done a bit of trudging around Cape Town trying to sell the wine, and people loved it, and so I had a bit of hope that it would take. But once Richard got hold of the wine and got it over to the UK and got in front of a few journalists, it was a crazy snowball effect. And I mean, just as one example of Providence, Neil Martin was in the Cape at the same time as Richard, and they happened to sit next to each other on the airplane on the way home. And Richard told Neil about this wine that he tasted, and then our wine was put onto at that time it was the portfolio of the company that Richard was working for, and so we suddenly had a UK importer, and I had to go and visit the UK later that year. So Neil asked to set up a meeting, and we managed to meet each other in a hotel lobby, and I gave him the wine. And by December, we'd sold out of the wine, quite a bit of it to the UK. We just had suddenly picked up importers from goodness knows where. They'd been reading the journalism, the stuff that had been written about the wine. It just all snowballed so quickly,
How was that validation?
It felt really amazing, it felt like really surreal, like really, really surreal that people actually liked the wine, and that actually, like, globally, like Jancis had it in her, Julia Harding tasted the wine for Jancis, and she wrote an unbelievable review for the wine, and they had it as their wine of the week in October. And Neil gave it 96, which I think at the time was the highest scoring South African white wine, ever, I think. And it made it was just people were talking about it, we just didn't understand how it was all happening.
What did you name the wine?
Cartology. The study of maps or charts, based on my obsessive looking at Google Earth and looking at I've got a map of the Cape in my office. I've always had one, and wondering about these far-flung mountains and lost vineyards and all of that stuff. And I'm good friends with a really good Pinot and Chard winemaker, actually just a good winemaker in general, called Peter Allen Finlayson, which I'm sure some of your listeners will have heard his name. And we used to drive around a bit in the early days when he also rented some space at this winery when we were still quite small. And we were trying to work out a name for the wine, and I already had the name Radio Lazarus. And I was fiddling around with names to do with something with maps and maybe cartography or something like that, and it just didn't sound. And then Finn just blurted out cartology. And I was like, shit, that's it.
And that was it. Cartology had its maiden vintage in 2011, and it was and still is considered to be one of the best white wines to come out of South Africa ever. Cartology is a blend of old vine Chenions with a touch of a very special old vine Semillon. And it is this touch of Sem that I find interesting.
And actually that idea came from that 2010 between the two vintages working as a wine steward at La Colombe. In the back of the restaurant, we had all the by the glass wines, that we had to check every night and make sure they were in good condition, etc. Checking the Boekenhout's Kloof Sem, and then right next to it was the beautiful Hope Marguerite from Beaumont, and then I just put a little bit of Hope Marguerite on top of the Sem, and it was largely Chenin and a bit of Semillon, and I just thought, yes, that really works on the palate. It changes the way the Chenin works. Chenin's got normally a good attack and quite a nice long finish normally, but sometimes can be a little bit hollow. Where Sem is very different. Sem can be a bit short, but it can be very deep. It can have a really awesome textured mid palate, and I found that even at quite low volumes, it makes quite a big difference to the way the wine moves over the palate. So we we always had a bit of Sem in there, and that was another example of Providence. 3 different people told me about that old Semillon vineyard in a space of a week, and I just thought, if I don't go and check this out, then I'm a fool. So I went there and I had a look, and there was La Colline. It was just there, basically undervalued, 80 something, or at that stage it was planted in 1936. At that stage it was in its late 70s or whatever it was. Old beautiful old Semillon just sitting there, and the Cape had all these little wonders sort of tucked away. And I had this kind of picture of how cool would it be to have Cartology as basically a village wine. And I remember saying that to Neil Martin the first time we met, even though it's the vineyards are very serious vineyards that are in that wine, it could form a foundational level for a business, which could then expand on the idea of this map of the Cape, by highlighting special parts of the Cape, and that's the path we've taken, basically. So,
but there is potential for paradox here. One might argue that if the winemaking philosophy is to express a particular piece of land, how then can you blend vineyards? Well, I think you can. Just as the Cape is a melting pot of different cultures representing its heritage, so too could a wine represent the Cape with more than one vineyard. But it was this idea, this Puritan view of the philosophy, that would lead Chris down a path of single vineyards and almost spelled disaster for our beloved Cartology.
And then in 2017, for that vintage, I really wanted to change gears, and I felt that we'd had a really good vintage in 17. And I was actually at that stage toying with the idea of letting 17 be the final vintage of Cartology. 7 vintages, call it a day. And that's really what I was thinking. And because I was going through a phase. At that stage, I was, getting probably almost a little puritanical with the philosophies of the thing that all wine should be from a place. And then I went to Barolo and I tasted wines that were from the whole of Barolo, from many different, not just one brico or one place, And I got over myself, and I realized that Cartology was very relevant still to people that wanted to understand, Cape heritage wine, and that even though it might not be a single vineyard wine, the Cape is still a place, and that's okay. So I got over it, and I actually kind of got a little bit more in love with Cartology, it's still my baby. Because I was in that state of mind, I took a step to release a lot more single vineyards. So I released the False Bay coast of Stellenbosch under Nautical Dawn, Paardeberg, the vineyards that are now under our control that we've bought since, under a label called Fire by Night. And then Heilkrans from Odam in the Scotsbrug, and we still already had the others, Magnetic North and La Colline. So we had now had a real kind of full house of really interesting single vineyards that all were, completely different wines, and that was a really high point for me in our winemaking life. That release of the 17s, I thought, really showed emphatically that, Chenin Blanc, and even Semillon, but in particular in this case Chenin Blanc as a vehicle for, the South African landscape is very articulate, and that's really exciting. So it's fine for me to have a bunch of different Chenins from different vineyards. And see how different they are, and despite that, for instance, the Fire by Night versus Nautical Dawn, they're both on granite soils in this case, but Nautical Dawn is very close to the sea in Stellenbosch, ripens a bit earlier. Fire by Night is facing north, not southeast, and it's on granite as well. On the Paardeberg Mountain. So you've got this Swartland Mountain versus seaside Stellenbosch on very similar soils, and also similar vine age, about around 40 years old, and they're so different.
Chris has stated that he believes Chenin is the grape that truly expresses the heritage of the Cape. But is there really no room for anything else in the future? You've kind of answered this already through this discussion, but why no red wines? Or are they on the cards?
Yeah, I really like red wine, and my wife Suzanne loves red wine. She drinks a lot more red wine than white wine. So yeah, as I said to you before, I think that at the time we started, I think that the Cape's white wines, were had a better chance of shooting the lights out overseas in terms of just outright quality, and that was then. I think a lot has happened with the red wine scene. I think probably better viticulture and understanding our sites a little bit better have led to some really stunning reds at the moment. I could obviously mention the Himmelnade because I've got a lot of friends here, and the Pinots are often quite convincing and very good. But the ones that have got my attention now are the Valsbeek Coast of Stellenbosch Shiraz wines, the Syrahs like Sons of Sugarland and Graft and those types of wines from these relatively cool south and southeast facing granite slopes close to the sea. We just remarkable wines, and then obviously what's happening in the Swartland with Syrah and then Grenache and Pekingese Kloof. We've got some very exciting reds, but I thought I would stay in our lane and stick with the heritage whites in order to specialize. And that if we ever did make a red, it would have to very much fit in with that identity as a South African heritage wine. And there aren't that many grapes that we can tell anyway from, as I said, the literature is quite foggy, that were here very early on. The one really strong candidate for being here very early and having quite an interesting identity that's very much linked to the Cape is Pontak. It's quite a rare grape in the global context. It's virtually extinct in Portugal, where it also resides, originally from the southwest of France, and I think named after the Pontak family, as far as I know, that used to own Haut-Brion in the 1700s. We had a fair bit of Pontak before Phylloxera, and it, certainly commentators like Leipold raved about dry Pontak, and before Phylloxera it was much more widely planted. Obviously it's almost extinct now, but if we do make a red, it would almost certainly be a Pontak, and we are now in the process of this year planting a small Pontak vineyard on our farm in the Swartland. I should mention that we bought that farm that we were buying grapes from for so many years on the Paardeberg, and according to the literature that we can find, Pontak does well on relatively warm, well-drained slopes around Paarl, which is granite soil. So we're not that far from Paarl. We have granites and we have very well-drained soil. So I'm hoping that we can turn out a good Pontak. The problem is virus with Pontak. The material we've got now is very rare and very virused. And so it's in the process of being cleaned up and now is finally available to plant. I think Hartenberg, who bottled the last commercial Pontak in 2000, have replanted a vineyard 2 or 3 years ago. So that should be close to production. I know Eben has got some in the ground, and we soon will have. So yeah, if we do make a red, it'll be Pontak, I think. But those, as I mentioned earlier, those Syrah wines from the Swartland and south of Stellenbosch, they really get me excited. And we are busy trying to start up a completely separate business, a different thing altogether with good friends of ours here in Amanus, just to make one wine, which would be a Syrah. Because I flippin' love Syrah. It's awesome.
Yeah, me too.
It's such a cool wine grape.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, wraps up the story and evolution of Alheit Vineyards, deeply rooted in Chenin Blanc and maps of the Cape. But before we go, who wants some wine? The guests of our show have all very kindly offered a single bottle of one of their special wines, which at the end of each episode will go to one lucky listener. To stand a chance to win, please go to winesofthesouth.co.za for details. Wines of the South is produced by Telltale Media and hosted by me, Neil. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Cheers for now, and we'll catch you next week for another journey through the vineyards of the South.